hit record here and begin our session. People can continue to log in, and that's fine. My name is Jamie Sennett, and I am with the Alumni Engagement Office here at Illinois State. And so, like I said, thank you for joining us today. It is my pleasure to host Dr. Ringer, who I will introduce in 1 second. This session is going to be recorded, and we will post it on our website. We have an entire page on our website, on the alumni website, that has our virtual engagement opportunities. So you actually can see a session that Dr. Ringer did a few months ago already on that page as well. But if you want to go back and get some extra notes that maybe you missed in the process, feel free to watch the recorded version. You'll get a link afterwards as well with your post-event survey. During today's session, Dr. Ringer is welcoming questions, and to do so, you can use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to use that. We'll address that at the end. So any questions we'll bring up to him and let him answer at the end of our session. Today's event is actually part of a series of 3-part series that we're doing on leadership development and different elements of that. It's a partnership with the College of Business and the Organizational Institute here at Illinois State University. So today's event obviously is speaking to humor in the workplace. Next week on the 18th, we are doing a session on virtual leadership, which will be really interesting. And then Dr. Ringer is going to join us again December 8th to talk about politics in organizations. So really excited to have the expertise of our faculty here at Illinois State share with you their knowledge. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Ringer. Dr. Ringer is a professor of management in the Department of Management and Quantitative Methods and is the director of the Organizational Leadership Institute, both at Illinois State University. Prior to joining ISU in 1994, Dr. Ringer worked in training and development in the Los Alamos National Laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Hopefully I said that right. Dr. Ringer's teaching area includes leadership, organizational behavior, and organizational change. His research interests include organizational leadership, management history, and organizational change. As the director of the Institute, Dr. Ringer's responsibilities include managing a variety of leadership development programs and activities for both College of Business students as well as local business and community. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Ringer.
Jamie, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate these opportunities as they come to engage and interact. Before we started, Lindsay and Jamie and I were just discussing casually, virtual technologies and Zooming, and I wish we could be physically together because I think that's a more enriching experience in a lot of ways. I think it provides opportunities to engage at a much deeper level. That conversation we can have, I think, is almost always superior and more worthwhile than what we could do electronically. But there's no question that having these technologies is an amazing blessing to us, that it's allowing us to do things that otherwise we would not be able to do at all. And so I'm really grateful that we can do these. I really enjoy the opportunity to share with you what I think some insights regarding leadership are. It's what I've been studying for the best part of my life. I think there's some things that are really worthwhile for us to think about. Humor is one of them. So as we go through this discussion, just one or two points to make beforehand. Please ask questions, get clarification. Jamie mentioned that we'll try to do it at the end. I'll try to manage my time, which, there are some of you who have heard me say that in numerous settings, and I'm not always really good at it. But I'll be mindful of ensuring that we end at an appropriate time where there is sufficient time for us to ask questions and for me to clarify anything. The second point is that humor is really just emerging as a really serious study. our discussions of leadership humor have been around a long time. They go back 20, even 30 years, but not in a really systematic way. And we're beginning now to really look at humor as in a much more scientific, much more rigorous way. So what I'm going to share with you are some basic principles that I think are our best understanding right now. And particularly what we'll focus on are what the benefits of humor to leaders are. And then talk about what some of the rules for using humor should be. All right. But first, let me just share a couple of introductory points to illustrate, believe it or not, and again, this shouldn't surprise you, there's a whole literature, there are journals on humor, what makes something funny. And there are lots of different explanations of, psychologically why things are funny or not funny. The one that I think for our purposes, and this is not the only way, what we call this benign violations theory. There's no reason for you to remember this beyond today. So it should not have a major impact on your life, but it does provide, I think, a little understanding in trying to understand why things in organizations are funny or why things in organizations would be offensive. And I'll give you an example in just a second, examples that you've probably both recognized, or that all of you are examples that all of you probably recognize. The best way, I think, of understanding organizational humor, again, is this, what we call this benign violations theory. And that's based on a very simple premise that there are three conditions to creating humor. One is there's actually a violation of some norm, a social norm, a moral norm, a linguistic norm, a physical norm. We have violated a community norm about what we say, what we do, how we interact. Right? But the violation takes place in what we call a benign or a safe context. And then we see the violation, we recognize that it's in a safe context. And the interpretation of those two events or those two aspects, we view the violation as harmless and therefore funny. Or we view the violation as severe and therefore not funny, perhaps even offensive. So let me give you two examples. Okay, you have very likely seen both of these. They were both tweets. They were both organizational examples. Both of these individuals were in professional settings and they were doing professional work at the time of the tweets. One is widely regarded as funny. The second is universally considered to be not only unfunny, but horribly offensive. But they serve as examples of what we're referring to, which is, humor is a violation of norms. When it's benign, it can be funny. When it's severe, it loses it. And it provides, I think, some context and some background for understanding how humor would then play out in an organization. So, first example. First full day as Twitter COO, Chief Operating Officer, tomorrow. Task number 1, undermine the CEO, consolidate power. Okay. The funny one. Now, the offensive one. And again, many of us probably saw this. Going to Africa. Hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding. I'm white. Now, all of us are looking at that and we realize number 1's kind of clever. Number 2 is horribly offensive. It in every way crosses the boundaries of what we would consider to be appropriate commentary. Both of these, however, are norm violations. So they fall into that understanding that humor consists of norm violations. But let's look at each one to try to understand why one is funny and the second is horribly unfunny and horribly offensive. So let's talk about the first one. First full day as Twitter COO. Tomorrow, task number 1, undermine the CEO, consolidate power. Okay, the tweet was by Dick Costolo, who actually did later become the CEO of Twitter. Okay? His prediction came true. It is a norm violation. Okay? We have a social norm. We shouldn't talk openly about taking our manager's job. There's a norm we share. We shouldn't publicly criticize our manager. We shouldn't mock them. We shouldn't talk about taking their job. So Costello violated a norm, a social behavioral norm. He said something that we generally say that you shouldn't say things like this. But it was clearly benign. It was harmless. He's clearly not serious. He's not attacking the CEO. So we would say, oh, well, that's funny. That's kind of clever. That's humorous, starting your first day as the chief operating officer and already making a little joke about how you're going to consolidate power and take over the CEO. Now, Dick Costello's advantages is that he did improv work earlier in his career, so he was known already for this type of behavior, this type of attitude. That was a significant help to him. Second example, I won't use the person's name. You could look it up if you wanted to. Okay. This is also a norm violation. It violates social and moral norms around joking about disease, joking about race, joking about death. Okay. You can do that in a benign way. Okay, we're seeing it now. Okay? For example, some of you are familiar that for millennials and post millennials, COVID is often referred to as the boomer remover. And it's making light of it. Now, I don't appreciate that humor, but it's probably more in the benign category than the extreme category. This category, going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white. It's a violation of moral and social norms around death, around disease, around race. But it is so extreme. It connects death and race in a way that violates the benign nature of humor. And in this regard, it's such a severe violation of those norms that it's not even close to funny. Rather, it's deeply offensive. And keeping this in mind as you think about humor in organizations, this is a good way to understand that when you're using humor, you're making fun of a situation, you're making fun of a policy, you make some quip about the importance or the value or the lack of value of a meeting. You are violating some norm about not being critical, some norm about being a good teammate, not mocking what the organization is doing. So we are violating norms, social norms, moral norms, linguistic norms, things that we should not do. But it's done in a way that is safe, that is benign. We understand that people aren't serious, and they, in fact, may be communicating an important message through the humor, and that becomes benign rather than extreme, severe, and just not unfunny, but horribly insensitive and offensive. And as bad of an example as this one is, there are probably bad examples that you can think of in your own careers, in your own experiences of people that have crossed a line like this. And so you have to be thoughtful about, that word benign, understanding that anytime you're using humor, you are engaging in a type of norm violation, but done in a way that is safe, that is kind in many ways, that is benign, is going to be more likely viewed as humor. Crossing that line, and in this case, significantly crossing the line, is a very, very dangerous thing to do, and obviously something you need to be mindful of. When we talk about humor, and we talk about what we mean by leadership humor, let me just share with you what I think are 5 general categories of the types of humor that we see in organization that tends to be functional in its use. It tends to have positive outcomes as long as it's appropriate humor. So category 1 would include the use of humor that is taking the edge off stressful or difficult situations, right? Times are tough. And we would be seeing a lot of this. There's a lot of humor that's going around with virtual work, COVID, which again, that's a tougher one because you're dealing with death and disease, and that tends to be much more difficult to keep it in the benign category. But certainly the nature of virtual work and the challenges that it presents to us, humor is used a lot and has a very functional role in helping us deal with stressful, difficult situations. Second category would be the use of humor in order to make a point in an argument, to communicate something critical, but in a humorous way. And what happens is it becomes less threatening, but the message is still clear. Third category would simply be the use of humor when people are overly serious, overly focused, maybe wearing themselves out a little bit. We're using humor to diffuse the seriousness. Hey, let's lighten up. Let's have some fun here. Fourth category would be the use of humor to make a point. Now, that's similar to point number two, but point number two is in a very specific sort of argument discussion. Point four would be the general use of humor to illustrate an important point in a conversation or in a team meeting. This is what we're really trying to accomplish. Again, to diffuse comment or tension, but also to build camaraderie, to build relationships, to strengthen relationships. Then the last would be similar to the previous one, but rather than stories, we're talking about wit, clever comments that also make a point, strengthen relationships, or reduce opposition. Humor can take lots of forms. It can be a joke. It can be a story. It can be a clever comment. It can be an insightful little quip. Okay? It can be all those things. Okay? The value of humor is that the key elements is that it tends to be workforce, work environment related, and has some functional outcome in terms of work processes for it to be useful and valuable to leaders. So it's more than just telling a joke. That's sometimes part of leadership humor. But most of us can tell a joke that somebody else wrote or that we heard on a late night talk show. That can be a part of leadership humor. But what we're really focusing on and where we really seem to see advantages in the benefits to leaders are more in a broader range, which refers to the ability to find and express humor appropriately in the workplace. So you can show up in the morning at 7:30 with a funny joke that you heard on television or read on Twitter. Okay? That's one type. The more valuable type, I think, is your ability as a leader to recognize, find, and express humor in the context of work life, the situations the shared situations that we have at work, what's happening at work, what's happening in society, what are we all experiencing together? Can you in those situations find and express appropriate humor? So it's finding humor in the absurdities of organizational life, and all organizations, even highly rational organizations, have absurdities. Meetings that don't accomplish anything, policies and procedures that no longer make any sense, a meeting that was 30 minutes long and that was 29 minutes too long, a product initiative that just doesn't make any sense, or even highly functional, highly rational organizations, because they're made up of people, contain absurdities, things that just don't make sense. Can we find the humor in them? Can we recognize the humor in difficult and challenging situations, particularly important now? Right? Do we find humor and happiness in the everyday grind, routine, and mundane activities of organizational life? And for many of us, as much as we love our jobs, there's some significant part of it that is just the routine and the mundane. that we do because the organization needs to have it done. I'm the person that's given the responsibility to do it, so I'm going to do it. All of us have routine, mundane activities, the grind. Can we find and express humor and happiness in that? And it's that third one that I think might have the biggest impact on not only leadership well-being, but on the well-being of those that work in that area. Then this last one are these clever commentaries, the comments about a situation or event. Can you see when something is absurd or something is incongruent, something weird, strange happened, something didn't quite work out the way it should have? Can you use humor to comment in a clever but benign way that's funny and is helpful to people? Let's talk about what the impact of humor is. And 5 general categories that I think are important for us to think about. Uh, and the first 2 will be the two that we will focus on the most. Okay. All 5 I think matter, but the first 2 points are the ones that I think for you, as you think about your leadership roles, either your current leadership roles or your aspirational leadership roles, are probably what's most critical to you. One, there's no question, and this is probably where the research is the strongest, and I think we have really pretty compelling evidence about this, that appropriate humor does increase status. And it increases status because it increases the perceptions of both confidence and competence. If you're funny, if you're appropriately funny, people believe you to be more confident and more competent, and both are really critical. Point 2, appropriate humor also increases personal attractiveness and likability, and it strengthens your interpersonal influence. And again, I think this one is pretty well established. Funny people, as long as it's appropriate, mean, inappropriate humor may be funny to some people, but it may not be appropriate, and it may not enhance likability and attractiveness. It may not, even though people may find it funny. Those 2, I think, are the ones that matter most to you, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit more depth. But let's just go through these other 3. There's no question that humor in organizations creates stronger social bonds, and we see that consistently in the literature. Again, it's a relatively new field. There's not a ton of literature, but what's emerging, I think, is fairly consistent. People just feel closer. They like their job. They feel closer to the people that they work with. Okay, let's use a silly example. If we step outside of organizational settings and we look into personal life settings, we consistently see when we look at this whole literature on what we call preferred mate characteristics. What do people look for in a mate? Someone they're going to spend their lives with, someone they may marry. Humor is always in there. He makes me laugh. She makes me laugh. Now that tends to be stronger among females than among males. As I read through it, females tend to report that somewhat more frequently than males do. He makes me laugh. Well, that illustrates the point. We like to feel happy. We like being amused. We feel close to people that make us feel happy. We feel close to people that make us feel amused. We feel more attracted personally. This does not refer to necessarily romantic or physical attraction. I use the word personal intentionally, but your character, your personality, your sense of self, when you're funny, appropriately funny, you become more attractive. People like you more. They want to be around you more. And I think that's clearly demonstrated in the research on leadership humor, and I think it's definitely demonstrated in the research we have on preferred mate characteristics. We tend to be both personally and physically more attracted to people who are funny. Is that true of every single one of you? No. We're not talking about a correlation of one here, but we're talking about a very strong effect. Right? So humor does create these stronger social bonds. That leaders that use appropriate humor, coworkers that use appropriate humor, they build these stronger social bonds. People feel closer. They like work. They like being there. It's a nicer place to be. They're more comfortable there. It increases both the quantity and the quality of communication. People just talk more with each other. And as it relates to professional responsibilities, the quality of communication is also likely going to be better. And it reduces what we would call the hierarchical status distinctions. Yes, humor increases personal status, but humor decreases hierarchical status. In other words, when the vice president, who's three layers of management above me, is a clever, funny person, and she's really kind, and she's always got a clever quip, that reduces the hierarchical barriers. She's more approachable. She's more human. She's a nice person, and that it may increase personal status, but it reduces the hierarchical status distinctions, which can be an important thing as it relates to communication and openness of communication, both upward and downward communication. Appropriate humor also increases the well-being of members of the organization and the team. They are just emotionally healthier because the workplace is simply a better place to work. I think again, there's really strong evidence. And because of that emotional well-being that people feel, they are far more likely to engage in what we call organizational citizenship behaviors. Some of you have probably run across this term before. They tend to be really important parts of organizational success. Organizational citizenship behaviors refer to those behaviors that people engage in that are not a specific part of their job description, yet I do them anyway. It's the person who makes the coffee in the morning, even though it's not a part of his job. It's the person who cleans out the fridge or makes sure the microwave is working or puts paper back in the printer when they've used it. That it's the person that organizes the birthday parties and the going away parties. It's the person that cheerleads others, that helps others be successful. These organizational citizenship behaviors are functional, discretionary. I'm not required to do them, but I do them anyway to be helpful to my coworkers, helpful to my team, helpful to the organization. And they contribute significantly to overall climate, but they also contribute to overall organizational performance. The point is, people are more likely to engage in those when they are emotionally well. Humor contributes to that emotional well-being. And the last, which I think is probably a little less supported, I think it's there. I'm a lot more confident about this. I'm a little less confident about this one, though there is some evidence. But I do think there's pretty clear evidence that appropriate humor can reduce stress, and some evidence that it can contribute to creativity. And the contributions to creativity would be based on the idea that humor makes us laugh. Humor makes us think about things a different way. Humor breaks the tension about a difficult problem, and in essence frees up our minds to absorb different stimuli. And it's that condition where our minds are open to thinking different ways that then contributes to creativity. I would agree that that's likely true. I just don't know that the evidence is as strong as it is in these other areas, which I think are certainly more compelling. All right. Let's talk about points 1 and 2. I mentioned that what I'd like to really focus on are these 2 points in the 20 minutes I have left. Those I think are the most critical for you. How does humor, and I put appropriate humor in each one of these. Inappropriate humor is going to kill you. All right, it just is. You have to be really careful. You know, what's funny in a locker room may not be funny at work. Right? What's funny with your friends over coffee on a Saturday morning may not be funny at work. And so you just have to be thoughtful and very careful. That's the use of the word appropriate. So there's no question, however, that appropriate humor leads to increased personal status. You have higher status. Right? It's linked to perceptions of status really through 2 ways. It's linked to perceptions of confidence. You have the confidence to say something that is dangerous. And we all recognize this. All of us, my guess is, have been reluctant to say something because we think it might be wrong. We think it might be inappropriate or inappropriate. Somebody says it and it turns out to be really funny. And we think, rats, I thought of that. Why didn't I say it? Right? It's an issue of confidence. We believe that people who are willing to try to express humor are more confident people. Confidence is clearly linked to both a leadership emergence and leadership performance. By leadership emergence, that term simply refers to who emerges as a potential leader, who gets identified as a potential leader. Confident people are more likely to be identified as potential leaders. Confident people tend to perform better in leadership roles. Expressing humor can increase the perception that you're a confident person because you're willing to say something that might actually, remember how we described humor. Humor tends to be a norm violation. We're violating some norm. We recognize that might be the wrong thing to say. That might be embarrassing. That might be offensive. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know. Right? Saying it tells people, hey, I'm confident. Right? The stronger link, I think, is to the perceptions of competence. People think you are more competent if you use humor appropriately. If you're a funny person, you say clever things, you're witty. Now, telling a joke, it doesn't have the same impact. Simply repeating a joke that someone else told doesn't have the same impact. Clever commentary about work, a witty remark, a clever comment in a difficult situation. Those are more what we're talking about here. Those are strongly linked to perceptions of competence because humor is a strong marker of intelligence. Expressing humor, wit, commentary, clever insights may suggest that the humorous individual is more intelligent. In other words, she can see and express something that the rest of us can't or didn't. That perceived intelligence is strongly linked to assessments of leadership competence. It just is. Now, you can be a really smart person and not be humorous, okay? Don't read more into this than is appropriate. But be aware that yes, there is this link that if you're able to use humor appropriately, it is increasing perceptions of your competence, likely via the mechanism of you're smart and clever. You saw something funny that none of us saw. You saw the humor in this that the rest of us missed, and you were able to express it. That tends to be an indication, a suggestion of intelligence. Now we're going to get back to this because, obviously simply being funny but not being good at your job is not enough. Okay? But it does help. There's no question that it does help. Both perceptions of both confidence and competence are, strongly contribute to enhance personal status. You're a more high status individual. You just are. You have status. Personal status is then linked to leadership emergence. You get identified as a leader more frequently. Leadership performance, you tend to be better at leadership because people think you are good as a leader. It increases reputation across the organization, the ability to create cross-organizational networks, and so on. Status is really important. Status is a significant source of organizational power. So using your humor to increase your status is a rather thoughtful approach to career management, except the use of inappropriate humor, what we would call those severe norm violations. They dramatically decrease perceptions of competence. How could he say something like that? Why would she think that was a funny thing to say? Now, interestingly enough, perceptions of confidence don't drop if the humor is inappropriate. For example, well, that was totally inappropriate, but it took courage to say something like that in this setting. So the perceptions of our confidence may not drop. Perceptions of our competence drop dramatically. Failed humor. And this is probably one of the 2 or 3 most important points you should take away from today. Failed humor is more damaging than no attempt at humor, especially if the failure is a result of inappropriate humor and not just an unfunny comment. Failed humor can be 2 kinds of failed humor. It just wasn't funny. You tried to make a joke, it wasn't a funny joke. It can be inappropriate. You said something grossly inappropriate. You mocked something. You engaged in a very severe norm violation. That's the more damaging thing to do. Both are damaging. Unfunny, inappropriate are both damaging. Inappropriate is far more damaging. The loss of competence is far greater than the maintenance of confidence. People still think you're confident because you had the guts to say something, but your competence goes down because it's a reflection of your judgment. How could you say that? That's a question of judgment. Now, how does it increase to perceived and personal attractiveness, personal likability? Those who use appropriate humor are simply more interpersonally attractive. They're more likable. They're more likable people. Funny people are, as long as it's appropriate humor. Both personal attractiveness and likability are strongly predictive of leadership emergence and leadership success. Leaders who are more likable, more interpersonally attractive, are viewed as more trustworthy and credible. There's a reputation effect. They're able to wield more non-hierarchical power and influence. In other words, even if they're not the manager, they're able to wield a lot of influence across the organization because they're liked, because they're respected. And they're able to build strong and mutually beneficial networks across the organization, right? And across the organization's boundaries. They're able to create those networks. Now, humor isn't the only reason. There are lots of factors that contribute to personal attractiveness and likability. Humor is one of them. Humor might be one of the more important ones, but it's not the only one. Okay? Some of you have seen this before because I've shared it before. Okay, it's taken from a Harvard Business Review about 15 years ago. Likability is along this scale. Competence is along this scale. Low competence, low likability, the incompetent jerk, we don't want them around at all. High competence, but low likability, the competent jerk, okay? We keep them, but we don't like working with them. Low competence, but high likability, the lovable fool, these people have a place. They stick around because they're likable. This is where we want to be, where you ought to think about being. High likability, high competence. Humor can contribute to both. It really can. So what you need to be aware of, some advice. No question. And again, I think the research is really clear on this. Humor can enhance your status and your interpersonal attractiveness. But it's also a skill that can be developed. Are some of us just funnier than others? Probably. Some of it may be innate personality, character traits, but it can be a trait that we can develop. But we have to be aware of the following. Okay? These are the 6 things to be thoughtful of. Always work to focus humor on the situation, not people. Appropriate humorous commentary about a funny, quirky, challenging, difficult situation is safe and probably beneficial. Okay? A meeting that went bad. Okay? A meeting that went too long. Okay? A product launch that was a disaster. Okay? Humor about a situation is much safer than humor about a person. Making jokes at the expense of someone else is very dangerous. Not just because that person is harmed, but others that observe it, it decreases their personal likability. You're making fun of somebody, we don't like that. You run the risk of a severe norm violation if you engage too much in mocking people. So be really careful about that. Focus humor on situations, not people. Now, sometimes that's fuzzy, it's a fuzzy boundary, but be careful. Be aware of context. Who is going to hear what you are about to say? Right? Who's going to hear what you're about to say? Take a moment. Think, where am I? Right? Humor does function as a social glue. We've talked about that. It binds people together. But it can have the opposite effect if your humor is viewed, for example, as bragging or as some type of insult to people or ideas. Even if some people might find it funny, they still may think it's inappropriate. And the impact actually may be negative on you, even if the joke itself, people laughed at. It's okay, for example, to make fun of marketing if you're in the marketing department. Right? Contextual situations and constraints. Social, ethnic, religious groups have what we call insider latitude. They can make humor and humorous commentary about their insider status. So a member of a religious group could make fun of his or her, religious practices or the quirkiness or how the world views them, and that's going to be okay inside because of what we call this insider latitude. Outsiders don't have that latitude, so we can't say, "Oh, wait, I heard that it was okay for you to say it." Well, yes, it is okay because I have insider latitude. You don't. Okay? So be really careful about the context of the situation. What's going to play well? Right now, I think be really careful of political humor. I just think it's too touchy. Unless you're really sure of the context, you're really sure of the people that are going to hear. I just think right now that's a really, really dangerous thing to do. Okay? Avoid inside jokes. In other words, only some of us get it because we're part of the history of the group. Others can feel ostracized if they're not part of that. So be careful about inside humor that only you and a few people get because you were there, you've been here long enough, you experienced the same thing. Just be really careful about that because it can make people feel like outsiders. It can damage the social cohesion of a group. You're going to have in-groups and out-groups. The in-group that got the joke because they were there and the out-group who didn't get the joke. What you said is you're really not a part of this. You don't belong here. So be really careful about inside jokes. When you're in doubt, don't say it. If there's any doubt in your mind, follow that first doubt. You might be wrong. It may have been really funny and perfect, but it's a tough call. It's a really tough call. But if you've got too much doubt, you probably don't want to say it. Consider the context. Who's here? Who's gonna hear the joke, the comment? what might by the reaction, what might the reaction be? If you're doing something formal, you have formal remarks, formal presentation, and you want to include humor, run your humor by people you trust. So they can give you some feedback. Oh, that's hysterical. They'll love that. Versus, I don't think you want to say that in this group. Okay. The cost of inappropriate humor is far greater than the cost of no humor. Okay. Saying something wildly inappropriate is far more dangerous, far more harmful to you interpersonally and professionally than not trying to be funny at all. Look, and this should not have to be mentioned, but I will anyway. Sexist, racial, crude, or just plain mean humor should always be avoided in professional settings. Always be avoided in professional settings. Look, if you've got a funny sexual joke and you're going to share it with your friends in a quiet moment, okay, that's different. In a professional setting, don't. It just raises questions, even if the joke is funny. Okay? People recognize it's funny, but it's not funny here, and it's not appropriate here. Okay? It raises questions of your professional judgment and your professional competence. So you have to be thoughtful. Now, organizations are going to develop their own norms and climate around this. And you're going to have to learn that, what's okay. The line between clever and offensive is not always clear. That line between benign and severe norm violations, it's not always crystal clear. Remember, you're not a professional comedian. They're expected to some extent to push boundaries and create controversy. But even there, it's within some limitations. You're not. So be thoughtful about that. My suggestion is, always err on the side of caution. I understand that it may feel really funny to you, but think about it. Think about it. Self-deprecating humor can be really valuable. If you're able to make fun of yourself a little bit, that's really valuable. It actually enhances social bonds, reduces status distinctions, but enhances professional status. Okay? But too much can damage perceptions of confidence, which we don't like. And it may also appear that you're fishing for compliments. If you're constantly degrading yourself and you think you're just being funny, if you're doing it too much, it ceases to be funny and it becomes a little bit pathetic. So be careful. And try to avoid self-deprecating humor unless it touches on a non-essential skill. Okay? Or you have no other way to disclose sensitive information or negative information. For example, I can add and subtract, but I draw the line at geometry. That's kind of clever. It's kind of funny. Geometry, shapes, lines. I can add and subtract, but I draw the line at geometry. That's probably okay for me to say. It's probably okay for somebody in a non-technical position. It may not be okay for a statistician to say, because now you're getting into, wait a minute, that's part of your core responsibilities. Why are you joking about that? Again, there are no hard and fast rules here. Self-deprecation is valuable as long as it's gentle and relatively infrequent. It has some real benefits. Avoid humor in feedback situations. Humor can diminish the perceived seriousness of the feedback. If you're joking about it or you're trying to use humor, humor may make it easier to give feedback, may make you feel more comfortable, but it may soften the message, and therefore people may discount the perceived seriousness of the feedback. Oh, you're really not too concerned about it because you're kind of laughing about it. So be careful there. Some final thoughts for you as we close up. Humor does enhance your status and interpersonal attractiveness. There's no question that it does. But don't be something that you're not. Okay? Authenticity in leadership and organizational settings does matter. So don't be something that you're not. Forced humor is often ineffective because it's not funny and perhaps because it's inappropriate. So if you're not comfortable, work on it, because you can benefit from being more comfortable with it, but don't be something that you're not. Status is built by more than just humor. Yes, humor contributes to it and can contribute a lot, but perceptions of your actual job performance also deeply impact perceptions of competence. Being funny but not good at your job is eventually going to decrease status. Right? Michael Scott, The Office. Being funny but not very good is status degradation. Right? Interpersonal attractiveness and likability can be built in lots of other ways, just not being the funny one. Appreciate and laugh at the humor of others. Join in when somebody says something funny. Laugh and thank others. Build that sense of, yeah, this is funny. Smile at others and engage in them in very positive ways. Be nice. You're having the same impact, even if you're not able to be clever and funny the way others are. Right? And then just take the absurdities of organizational life in stride. Be good-natured about it. Take delight, maybe a little strong, but be good-natured about it. There are lots of different ways that you can increase your interpersonal attractiveness. Humor is a great way to do it. I would suggest that you think about it, because I do think the evidence is pretty compelling. But the other side of that is, don't force it. Don't try to be something you're not. Develop it carefully. But keep in mind that there are lots of other ways to enhance your status other than humor. So focus on those ways as well. Okay? Questions, rebuttals, counter arguments, acknowledgement of how this has changed your life. That's the one I want to hear most.
Thank you, Dr. Ringer. Thank you, thank you. We do have a couple comments and a couple questions, I believe. The first comment was with regards to humor. It says, when in organizations talk about work-life balance, there's a reason that work comes first and it's not alphabetical.
Really fair question. Yeah, I think that's a fair commentary. And I think that's a clever comment. There's a reason that it's not alphabetical. Work does come first. And I think that's Kevin, thank you. That's just an insightful, clever comment on, work-life balance is great until, and that's how humor can help. That exact comment. So Kevin, you're well on the road here. That exactly is what we're talking about here. It's a comment about the absurdity of people saying there's work-life balance, because we know in our heart it's really not. Organizations may try, but we really know that, work comes first. Yeah, that's a great example. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question is, if I wanted to read more about this topic, any suggestions?
Yeah, I'm gonna make available to Jamie a good Harvard Business Review that reviews, and I base a lot of this presentation on some of the content, because it's a really good summary of what the literature says. I'll make that available to Jamie, and she can send the site out to those of you. It's a very recent Harvard Business Review, talks about a lot of the same things that I talked about. I drew on that along with some other things, and that itself drew on the research that I had done. So yeah. Now the problem that we have, Michelle, is, who writes the jokes for us? We can't give a whole lot of help on how to write a funny joke, how to say something funny, how to recognize. There's not a lot on how to recognize humor and how to be more humorous. It's probably a lot based on seeing how others do it and then mimicking our behavior on theirs, and always recognizing, be safe, be gentle, especially as you're early in the process of learning the skill.
That's awesome. And then Kevin just had a comment about, he appreciated the comments around self-deprecating humor, which I did as well. I found that insightful.
Yeah, it's great. It can be really valuable, but you have to tread lightly. You can't overdo it, because then it becomes damaging. People get tired of it, quite honestly. Would you just please shut up? Types of comments. But if you screwed up, self-deprecation can be a great way to say, hey, I screwed up, I'm sorry. It can be a part of a really good apology approach. But it is a good way to soften bonds and or to create stronger social bonds and to acknowledge a mistake and to acknowledge, hey, I'm not very good at this. So.
Well, I think that is all the questions we have. So once again, we want to thank Dr. Ringer.
Actually,
Is there one more?
yeah, there are a couple that were actually Q&As I'm looking
Oh,
at
I'm
from
so
Sal.
sorry.
Yeah, hey Sally Pine, how you doing?
Oh, you were right. You got it.
Yeah, I think there are two ways that humor could be a threat to leadership. The one is that leaders can be threatened by others who are funnier, because we know that humor increases status. And so, yeah, I think it can be a threat to people who are in leadership roles who maybe aren't as funny, and they view that person as a competitor. So yeah, I think it can be a careful thing, and I think that's where leaders need to be mindful of not overreacting to it and appreciating it without overplaying their hand, so to speak, of making a mess out of it. So if that makes any sense. But I think, Sally, you're absolutely right. If humor does increase status, the leader who's not very funny, but the second in command who's super funny, that could be a threat to the non-funny leader. So.
Okay. And then
Mr. Miller, always nice to hear from you, Sam. I keep quoting you in class.
Yes. Okay, and then there's this one. It says, if I'm in the presence of someone who has tried to use humor but has failed, is there something that I can say to help the situation?
It depends on the hierarchical relationship. If you're the boss, absolutely. That needs to be part of a performance discussion. The issue would be, is it simply unfunny, or is it unfunny because it's offensive? Those are two different things. If it's offensive humor, then I think it has to be confronted, because that's damaging not only the organization to the setting, but that's much more damaging to the individual. If it's simply unfunny, then I think you have a little more latitude to say, okay, I'm not going to make a big deal out of this. If there's a hierarchical relationship, you're the manager, this person's a direct report, then I think you have a professional obligation to address it. It's part of your job. Part of your job is to help manage the performance of other people. And if there are performance inadequacies, you have that responsibility to address it. So I think you should. If it's a peer relationship, then I think it's maybe a little bit more challenging. If it's a reverse hierarchical, you're reporting to somebody who's not very funny, then I think you're looking for a way to preserve your anonymity, because that's a highly risky thing to do. But yeah, I think there are things that you can do. I think if it's a peer relationship, and I think if you're close, I think you can have a crucial conversation. I think you can go off site and say, hey, I'm going to go buy you a cup of coffee. As soon as we've had our Pfizer vaccines in 4 months, I'm going to go have a cup of coffee, and over a cup of coffee, I'm going to say, hey, look, you're my dearest, closest friend in this department. I want you to be successful, but you need to know that when you say this and say this and say this, no one in the department thinks it's funny. In fact, a couple of people have commented on how they wish you would stop. In the same principles that we've talked about in other settings, when you're giving people feedback, describe the specific behavior, describe the impact. So just don't say, you're not funny, stop it. Give specific examples. Did you notice when you said that, nobody laughed? And everybody left the room very quickly. You need to think twice about trying to say those things in those types of settings. It's hurting you, not helping you. And this is how I know. But I think you can find ways to approach it, and you probably should. I know we're out of time. I'm happy to stay on, Jamie, if people want to stay on.
Okay, I think there was just one more comment that I saw that mentioned that they often use funny lines in plays, which sends the message to others that I'm funny, but acting as a safe place to be funny.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, and the point that Eric is making is that all of us can be funny if we're reading what somebody else really funny has written. But acting is a part of just not reading the line. Acting is a part of reading the line and repeating the line and adding to the humor through your own ability and tone and nuance and physical behavior. So it's more than just reading the line. So I would say is that yes, reading a line that someone else has written that's funny is one thing, but making it even funnier is what a great actor does. I think that does transmit. I think that ability to find the humor and use the humor appropriately, even in an acting role, is a great way. That's why, a lot of people recommend improv in leadership development, because it does develop the ability to be thoughtful, clever, insightful in a controlled environment, and you can transfer those skills. So I do think there's some real value in that. And learning to use your humor and find the humor. So.
Okay, I think that is it this time, unless did I miss anything that you saw, Dr. Ringer?
I think I've got through everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, once again, thank you, Dr. Ringer. We
thanks for
so
having
appreciate
me.
you joining us and sharing your expertise with us. And every time there's always a bunch of takeaways that I've continued to, and I've heard you many times, so I just continue to glean something every time. But it's been a pleasure, and thank you to everyone else for joining us today. As I mentioned, this is a recorded version, so this will be available on our website. You will get a survey post-event and be asked to link from there or provide any feedback or suggestions for future events. And keep in mind, if you're interested in this type of development, we do have those other events coming up. One is on November 18th and one is on December 8th, so please join us. But with that, if no other questions, we will just stop our recording here. And thank you again to Dr. Ringer.